The blood-stained snow told a story of desperation, each crimson droplet marking the path where a small bear cub stumbled through the gathering dusk. His dark fur was matted with ice, his breathing labored as he fought against exhaustion and the biting cold. Oliver, barely 8 months old, was running out of time. The forest around him had fallen silent as if nature itself held its breath, watching this tiny creature's desperate journey through the deepening twilight. He had been searching for hours, driven by a primal instinct and an intelligence that seemed beyond his years. His mother's agonized cries still echoed in his mind, pushing him forward despite the pain in his torn paw. The wind howled through the bare branches, carrying with it the promise of another storm. Oliver's instincts screamed at him to find shelter, to curl up somewhere warm and wait out the weather. But he couldn't, not while his mother lay trapped and bleeding, her life slowly ebbing away in that dark place he'd been forced to leave behind. He had to find help, had to bring someone back before it was too late. Through the swirling snow, a glimmer of light caught his attention. Oliver's heart raced as he recognized a familiar flash of red and blue lights he'd seen before from a safe distance, when watching the strange two-legged creatures in their metal machines. His mother had always warned him to stay away from humans, but now they were his only hope. Officer Michael Brooks was just finishing his routine patrol of the mountain roads when he first spotted the small shape moving through the darkness. Initially, he thought it was a dog that had gotten loose from one of the nearby camping grounds. But as his patrol car's headlights illuminated the approaching figure, his breath caught in his throat. The bear cub couldn't have been more than 8 months old, far too young to be alone in these conditions. Michael's 15 years of wildlife experience told him something was very wrong. Bear cubs this age should be with their mothers, especially with winter closing in. He watched as the cub stumbled closer, noting its irregular gait and the way it favored its right front paw. The radio at his belt crackled with static, but he barely noticed, his attention fixed on the extraordinary scene unfolding before him. "Hey there, little one," Michael said softly, keeping his voice low and steady as he slowly opened his car door. The cub stopped about 20 feet away, swaying slightly on its feet. Blood stained the snow beneath its paw, but what struck Michael most were its eyes, deep brown pools filled with an intelligence and urgency that seemed almost human. The cub made a soft whimpering sound, taking a few steps closer before turning to look back the way it had come. Then it did something that made Michael's heart skip a beat. It looked directly at him and let out a series of distressed vocalizations before taking another few steps and looking back again. Michael had seen this behavior before, but never from a wild animal. It reminded him of search and rescue dogs he'd worked with, the way they would guide handlers to people in distress. "You want me to follow you, don't you?" he whispered, hardly believing what he was seeing. The cub responded with another whimper, more urgent this time. Its eyes never left Michael's face as he slowly reached for his tranquilizer gun, standard equipment for wildlife officers in these mountains. But something made him hesitate. The cub wasn't showing any signs of aggression. If anything, it seemed desperate for his help. Making a decision that went against every protocol he'd learned, Michael left the tranquilizer in its holster. Instead, he grabbed his medical kit and an emergency pack from the trunk. The cub watched his every move, its body trembling from cold and exhaustion. But it didn't run. If anything, it seemed to grow more animated as it realized Michael was preparing to follow. "Dispatch, this is Officer Brooks," he spoke into his radio, keeping his eyes on the cub. "I'm at marker 47 on Mountain Pass Road. I've got a situation with an injured bear cub showing unusual behavior." I'm going to follow and investigate. We'll maintain radio contact. The response came back immediately, crackling with concern. Officer Brooks, please confirm you're following an injured bear cub. Do you need backup? Michael watched as the cub took a few more steps into the darkness, then turned back to look at him imploringly. Negative on immediate backup, he responded. But have wildlife rescue on standby. Something's not right here. This cub is trying to lead me somewhere, and I need to find out why. As he stepped away from his patrol car, the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of the storm that had been threatening all day. The cub let out another soft cry, more urgent now, as if it understood that time was running out. Okay, little one, Michael said quietly, switching on his powerful flashlight. Show me what's so important. The beam cut through the gathering darkness, illuminating the trail of blood drops that marked the cub's path. As they moved away from the road and deeper into the forest, Michael felt a growing sense that he was about to discover something that would change his life forever. The cub's determined limping and constant backward glances told him that whatever lay ahead was a matter of life and death. The storm was closing in, and somewhere in these dark woods, a mystery waited to be unraveled. Michael tightened his grip on his flashlight and followed the brave little bear into the unknown, knowing that this night would test everything he thought he knew about the line between wild animals and human compassion. Michael's boots crunched through the deepening snow as he followed the bear cub's unsteady path into the darkness. The wind had picked up, driving ice crystals against his face like tiny needles. His flashlight beam bounced off the swirling snow, creating an eerie tunnel of light, through which Oliver continued to guide him, the cub's determination evident in every painful step. 15 years of wildlife service had taught Michael to trust his instincts, but those same instincts were now at war with each other. Everything he had learned screamed that following a wild animal into the forest at night was foolish, possibly suicidal. Yet something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain, told him this was different. The memory of a similar night 3 years ago flashed through his mind, the night he'd found 2 orphan wolf pups whose mother had been killed by poachers. He'd seen intelligence in their eyes too, but nothing like this. Oliver stopped suddenly, his small body trembling as he tested the air with his nose. The cub's eyes reflected the flashlight beam, 2 golden orbs floating in the darkness. Michael paused to radio in his position, though he knew the worsening storm would soon make communication impossible. Dispatch, Officer Brooks. We're about half a mile east of the road now, heading deeper into Miller's Grove. The cub appears to be following some kind of trail. The response was barely audible through the static. Copy. Signal weak. Storm intensifying. Please exercise extreme caution. Michael clicked his radio in acknowledgement, knowing it might be his last clear communication for a while. The snow was falling harder now, already beginning to cover the blood trail they had been following. Oliver seemed to sense the urgency, his soft whimpers becoming more insistent as he looked back at Michael with those impossibly knowing eyes. I'm still with you, buddy, Michael assured him, though his voice was nearly lost in the howling wind. The cub had led him off any marked trails now, through thick underbrush that clawed at his clothes. The terrain was becoming treacherous, the ground sloping sharply beneath the snow. One wrong step here could mean a serious fall. A memory surfaced, his first instructor at the Wildlife Service, old Jim Parker, telling him about the fine line between courage and foolishness. The mountains don't care about your good intentions, Jim had said. They'll kill you just the same. But Jim had also taught him something else. Sometimes breaking protocol was the only way to do what was right. Oliver's path took them past a fallen oak, its massive trunk creating a momentary shelter from the wind. Michael paused there, checking his GPS. They were entering one of the oldest parts of the forest, an area honeycombed with abandoned mining tunnels from the previous century. His unease grew. If the cub was leading him toward one of those tunnels, things could get complicated fast. The bear cub waited impatiently, shaking snow from his fur. In the brief moment of clarity, Michael noticed how the blood from Oliver's injured paw had nearly stopped flowing, the cold doing its work to slow the bleeding. But that same cold was now their enemy. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and even with his heavy gear, Michael could feel it seeping into his bones. They pressed on, the forest growing denser around them. Michael's flashlight caught glimpses of movement in the darkness, the nocturnal residents of these woods watching their strange procession with wary eyes. A great horned owl called out somewhere above them, its mournful cries seeming to echo the urgency of their mission. Suddenly, Oliver froze, his entire body going rigid. Michael's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, years of training taking over as he scanned the darkness. Then he heard it, a deep, pain sound carrying faintly on the wind. It was unlike anything he'd heard before, a cross between a moan and a whimper, but much larger than what a cub could produce. The sound galvanized Oliver. The cub lurched forward with renewed energy, his injury seemingly forgotten in his desperation to move faster. Michael followed, his heart pounding as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place, the cub's behavior, the blood trail, and now the sound. They were heading toward something big. The terrain grew steeper, forcing Michael to use one hand to steady himself against trees as they climbed. His flashlight caught something metallic gleaming through the snow, old mining equipment, half buried and rusted. They were definitely in the old mining district now, and that knowledge sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Oliver disappeared around a large boulder, and when Michael followed, he found himself in a small clearing. The cub stood at its center, looking back at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. The sound came again, louder now and definitely coming from somewhere ahead of them. Michael swept his flashlight beam across the clearing, and that's when he saw it, a dark opening in the rock face, partially hidden by fallen debris. An old mine entrance. The cub moved toward the opening, then stopped, turning to look at Michael with what could only be described as desperation. Another pain sound echoed from the darkness, and this time Michael understood with crystal clarity. They had found what Oliver had been leading him to all along. "Dear God," he whispered, reaching for his radio, even knowing it would be useless now. The storm raged around them, but in that moment, standing at the threshold of that dark opening with a desperate bear cub by his side, Michael Brooks knew he was about to face one of the greatest challenges of his career. Whatever lay in that darkness needed help, and he was now the only hope it had. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, and somewhere in the depths of the old mine, something answered its call with another mournful cry. Oliver looked up at Michael, snow collected on his dark fur, his eyes reflecting a trust that transcended the natural order of things. There was no turning back now. They had come too far, and time was running out. The beam of Michael's flashlight cut through the darkness of the mine entrance, revealing timbers groaning under decades of weight and neglect. The air that rushed out was stale and carried a metallic tang that made his skin crawl. Oliver had already disappeared inside, his small form swallowed by the shadows, leaving Michael no choice but to follow. "This is crazy," he muttered, ducking under a partially collapsed support beam. The mine shaft wasn't particularly narrow, but the weight of the mountain above seemed to press down on him, making the space feel smaller than it was. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, each drop echoing like a tiny gunshot in the confined space. The cub's soft whimpers guided him deeper, bouncing off the ruined walls. Michael's training kicked in as he assessed the tunnel's stability, noting the signs of recent disturbances. Fresh claw marks on the walls and disturbed earth on the floor. Something large had moved through here, and recently. They rounded a bend in the tunnel, and Michael's flashlight beam caught something that made his heart stop, a massive steel trap. Its rusty jaws spread wide like the mouth of some prehistoric monster. Poachers, the realization hit him like a physical blow. Despite all their efforts to patrol the area, someone had been setting illegal traps in these old mines. Oliver's urgent cries drew him forward past the first trap and deeper into the tunnel. The air grew thicker, heavy with the scent of blood and fear. Michael's flashlight finally found what they had come all this way to find, and the sight made his throat tight with emotion. There, in a wider section of the tunnel, lay one of the largest female bears he'd ever seen. She was magnificent, even in her current state, her dark fur gleaming dully in the flashlight beam, her massive form taking up most of the space. But it was her situation that made Michael's blood run cold. Her right hind leg was caught in another steel trap, this one having sprung close with devastating force. Blood had pooled around the injury, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Oliver rushed to his mother's side, making soft sounds of distress as he nuzzled her face. The large bear, whom Michael would later name Bella, lifted her head slightly at her cub's return, showing a glimmer of the immense strength that must normally reside in her powerful frame. Her eyes, when they met Michael's, held no fury or fear, only exhaustion and what seemed like resignation. "Oh, sweet girl," Michael breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "What have they done to you?" He keyed his radio, knowing it was futile but trying anyway. Nothing but static answered him. He was on his own, at least for now. Moving slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, Michael approached the trapped bear. Oliver watched him intently but made no aggressive moves, seeming to understand that this human meant no harm. Bella's eyes tracked him too, but she remained still, either too weak or too intelligent to waste energy on fear. The trap was a vicious piece of work, its teeth having bitten deep into Bella's leg. The amount of blood suggested she'd been struggling for hours before exhaustion won out. The fact that she was still alive spoke to her incredible will to survive, likely driven by her cub's presence. Michael set his pack down and began to assess the situation, speaking softly as he worked. "Okay, girl. We're going to get you out of this, but I need you to trust me, just like your brave little boy here does." He reached into his pack for his heavy gloves and tools, never taking his eyes off the injured bear. Releasing a bear from a trap was dangerous work under the best conditions. Doing it in a dark mine alone, with a storm raging outside, was about as far from ideal as it could get. But looking at Oliver's trusting face and Bella's quiet suffering, Michael knew he had no choice. The trap's mechanism was simple but brutal, a powerful spring driving steel jaws together. Releasing it would require significant force, and the risk was that Bella might panic when freed. Despite her current weakness, in the confined space of the mine, that could be fatal for all of them. "Easy now," Michael murmured, positioning himself by the trap. He pulled out the special tools he carried for exactly this purpose, heavy-duty springs designed to force the trap's jaws apart. Oliver pressed closer to his mother's head as if understanding the need to keep her calm. The next few minutes were filled with the sound of Michael's controlled breathing and the creak of metal as he fought with the trap's mechanism. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, his muscles straining against the brutal device. Bella remained remarkably still, only the occasional twitch betraying her pain. Finally, with a harsh metallic snap, the trap's jaws released their grip. Bella let out a low moan but didn't move, her leg too damaged for any sudden movement. Michael quickly pulled the trap away, his stomach turning at the sight of what it had done to her leg. The wound was deep but clean. If they could get her proper medical attention soon, she might keep the leg, but that was a big if. They were miles from any road, in the middle of a snowstorm, with no immediate hope of backup. Oliver moved to inspect his mother's newly freed leg, his small nose twitching as he sniffed the injury. Michael used the opportunity to pull out his first aid kit, though he knew its contents were woefully inadequate for an injury of this magnitude. Still, he had to try. "This is going to sting," he warned, pulling out antiseptic and bandages. Bella's eyes met his again, and in that moment, Michael felt a connection that transcended the natural barrier between human and wild animal. There was trust there, born of desperate circumstances and her cub's faith in him. As he began to clean and bandage the wound, Michael's mind raced through possible solutions. They couldn't stay in the mine, the risk of collapse was too high, and Bella needed real medical attention. But moving a severely injured bear through a snowstorm seemed equally impossible. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if mocking his dilemma. Oliver pressed against his mother's side, his small body providing what warmth he could. Michael knew he had to make a decision soon. Their time was running out, and somewhere in these mountains, the people responsible for this trap might be planning to return to check their handiwork. The beam of his flashlight caught the gleam of Bella's eyes once more, and in them he saw both trust and challenge. Whatever he decided, it would take everything he had, and maybe more, to save this remarkable family. The howling wind outside the mine entrance had grown into a full-blown blizzard, turning the world beyond into a swirling white chaos. Michael finished securing the last bandage around Bella's injured leg, his hands steady despite the gravity of their situation. The temporary dressing wouldn't hold for long, but it was the best he could do with his limited supplies. The real challenge lay ahead, somehow getting a severely injured 400-pound bear through the storm to safety. Michael checked his phone again, no signal. His radio crackled with nothing but static. The storm had effectively cut them off from any hope of immediate rescue. Oliver sat pressed against his mother's massive head, occasionally making soft sounds of encouragement as she fought to stay conscious. The cub's own injured paw had left small blood stains in the dirt, but he seemed to have forgotten his pain in concern for his mother. "We can't stay here," Michael said aloud, more to himself than his companions. The old mine's supports creaked ominously above them, and the air was growing colder by the minute. If they didn't move soon, hypothermia would become as much of a threat as Bella's injury. But moving an injured bear through a blizzard seemed like an impossible task. Michael's training kicked in, breaking down the impossible into manageable pieces. First, they needed something to help move Bella. His flashlight beam swept the mine tunnel, catching a glimpse of abandoned mining equipment. There, half buried under decades of debris, he spotted what looked like an old or cart platform. It wasn't ideal, but with some modification, it might work as a makeshift sled. Working quickly, Michael cleared the platform and used rope from his pack to create a crude harness system. The metal was rusted but still solid, its flat surface large enough to support Bella's weight. The real question was whether they could get her onto it. "Okay, girl," he said softly, approaching Bella's head. "This is going to hurt, but it's our only chance." Her dark eyes met his, showing an intelligence that still amazed him. Oliver watched intently as Michael began positioning the platform next to his mother's massive form. The next 30 minutes were a symphony of grunts, careful movements, and barely suppressed pain. Using his emergency blanket as a slide, Michael managed to gradually work Bella onto the platform. She showed remarkable cooperation, seeming to understand the necessity of their actions despite the pain it caused her. Oliver moved with them constantly at his mother's head, offering comfort through soft touches and gentle sounds. By the time they had Bella secured to the platform, Michael was drenched in sweat despite the cold. His muscles trembled from the effort, but they couldn't afford to rest. The storm was getting worse, and they had a treacherous journey ahead of them. "Dispatch, this is Officer Brooks," he tried one last time on his radio. "I'm attempting to transport an injured adult female bear from the old Miller's mine. If anyone copies, we're heading for the East Access Road." Only static answered him, but he had to believe someone would be looking for them by now. The journey out of the mine was slow and dangerous. Michael had to carefully maneuver the makeshift sled through the narrow passages, using his own body as a brake on the steeper sections. Oliver followed closely, occasionally looking back as if to ensure they were still on the right path. The cubs' earlier fatigue seemed forgotten in the urgency of their mission. When they finally emerged from the mine, the full force of the storm hit them like a physical wall. The wind drove snow and ice horizontally through the air, reducing visibility to mere feet. Michael's flashlight beam was almost useless, swallowed by the swirling white. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and he could feel the cold trying to work its way through his heavy jacket. "Stay close, Oliver," he called out, though his voice was nearly lost in the wind. The cub pressed against his leg in response, providing an anchor point in the whiteout conditions. Together, they began the arduous task of pulling Bella through the storm. Every step was a battle against both the elements and exhaustion. The makeshift sled moved reluctantly through the deepening snow, its metal runners catching on hidden obstacles. Michael's muscles screamed in protest as he leaned into the harness he'd fashioned, pulling with everything he had. Bella remained remarkably still on the platform, though occasional whimpers of pain escaped her when they hit particularly rough patches. Time became meaningless in the white void of the storm. Michael focused only on putting one foot in front of the other, using his GPS unit to maintain their general direction toward the road. Oliver stayed with them, sometimes leading the way, sometimes pressing against his mother's form on the sled as if lending his strength to their desperate journey. An hour into their trek, disaster struck. The sled hit a hidden log beneath the snow, jerking violently to one side. Michael heard the crack of breaking metal before he felt the platform shift. One of the runners had snapped, turning their already difficult journey into an almost impossible one. "No, no, no," he muttered, dropping to his knees to examine the damage. The cold had made the old metal brittle, and the brake was clean. Without both runners, the sled would be almost impossible to pull through the deep snow. Oliver whined urgently, pressing against Michael's side. The cub's fur was caked with ice, his small body trembling from cold and exhaustion. Bella lifted her head slightly, her eyes reflecting the dim light of Michael's flashlight. In that moment, looking at these two remarkable animals who had trusted him with their lives, Michael felt a surge of determination. Pulling off his outer jacket, he wrapped it around the broken runner, creating a makeshift ski from the tough fabric. It wouldn't last long, but it might buy them enough time to reach help. The cold immediately bit through his remaining layers, but he ignored it. They were all in this together now. "We're not giving up," he told his companions, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Not when we've come this far." Oliver made a soft sound of agreement, and together they resumed their journey through the heart of the storm. Somewhere ahead lay safety and help, if they could just hold on long enough to reach it. The wind continued to howl around them, and the snow fell ever thicker. But in that moment, their small group moved forward as one, driven by determination, desperation, and a bond that had formed in the darkest of circumstances. The night was far from over, and their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The storm seemed to be intensifying, if that was even possible, as Michael fought to maintain their course through the blinding snow. His GPS was their only reliable guide now, its small screen showing they were less than a mile from the main road. But in these conditions, that mile might as well have been 100. His makeshift repair on the sled runner was failing, the jacket now torn and barely holding the metal pieces together. Bella's breathing had become more labored, each exhale creating small clouds in the freezing air. The bandages around her leg were soaked through, whether from blood or snow, Michael couldn't tell anymore. Oliver stayed close to his mother, occasionally nuzzling her face when her eyes started to drift closed, keeping her conscious through sheer determination. "Just a little further," Michael encouraged, though his own strength was failing. The cold had worked its way deep into his bones, and without his outer jacket, hypothermia was becoming a real concern. His hands were numb inside his gloves, and each breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. But he couldn't stop, not now, not when they were so close. A sudden gust of wind nearly knocked him off his feet, sending him stumbling against a tree. The impact jarred his shoulder painfully, but it also triggered a memory. These trees, he knew them. They were near the old ranger station, a small outpost that had been abandoned years ago when budget cuts forced the department to consolidate their operations. "Change of plans," he muttered, adjusting their course slightly. The station wouldn't have medical supplies, but it would offer shelter from the storm until help could reach them, if it was still standing at all. Oliver seemed to sense the change in their direction, looking up at Michael, questioning. "Trust me, buddy," he said, reaching down to briefly touch the cub's ice-covered fur. "Just one more push." The next 20 minutes were a blur of exhaustion and determination. Michael's world narrowed to the small circle of visibility his flashlight provided and the constant pull of the sled behind him. His muscles burned with fatigue, but he forced himself to keep moving, knowing that stopping now would mean death for all of them. Then, through the curtain of snow, a dark shape emerged. The old ranger station stood like a sentinel in the storm, its weather-beaten walls a promise of sanctuary. Michael's relief was short-lived, however, as he realized their greatest challenge still lay ahead. Getting Bella inside. The station's door was frozen shut, requiring all of Michael's remaining strength to force it open. The interior was cold and musty but blessedly free from the howling wind. His flashlight beam revealed old furniture covered in dust, including a large wooden table that would have to serve as their examination space. "Okay, girl," Michael said, turning to Bella. "One last move, I promise." He positioned the sled as close to the table as possible, then began the painstaking process of trying to move a severely injured bear onto a stable surface. Oliver watched anxiously, making soft sounds of encouragement to his mother. It took every ounce of strength Michael had left, but somehow they managed it. Bella now lay on the table, her massive form making the old wood creak ominously. The light from Michael's flashlight revealed the full extent of her injury. The bandages were completely soaked through, and her leg was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Working quickly, Michael pulled out his remaining medical supplies. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until help arrived. As he began cleaning and rebandaging the wound, Bella remained surprisingly still, only occasional tremors running through her powerful frame betraying her pain. Oliver had found an old blanket in a corner and was attempting to drag it toward them. Michael smiled despite their dire situation. The cub's determination to help was touching. He helped Oliver spread the blanket over his mother, knowing that keeping her warm was crucial now. Using the station's old radio equipment would be useless in the storm, but Michael kept trying his department radio, hoping that being stationary might help him find a signal. Between attempts, he worked to seal the drafty windows and door as best he could, using anything he could find to keep out the bitter cold. Hours passed like this, Michael moving between caring for Bella, trying to radio for help, and fighting to keep them all warm. Oliver never left his mother's side, his small body pressed against her neck, sharing what warmth he could. The bond between them was palpable, a reminder of why they had all fought so hard to get here. Just before dawn, when Michael's hope was starting to fade, his radio crackled to life. Through the static, he heard a familiar voice. "Officer Brooks, do you copy? We've got search teams near your last known coordinates." Michael's hands shook as he keyed the radio. "This is Brooks. We're at the old ranger station off Miller's Trail. Adult female bear with severe leg injury from an illegal trap, plus one cub. Need immediate medical transport and wildlife rescue team." The response was immediate. "Copy that. Teams are en route. Hold your position." Relief flooded through Michael's body, making his knees weak. He slumped against the table where Bella lay, reaching out to touch her fur gently. "Help's coming, girl, you hear that? We made it." Bella's eyes met his, and in them, he saw the same trust that had brought them through the storm. Oliver, seeming to understand that something had changed, let out a soft sound of contentment. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease, the first gray light of dawn penetrating the swirling snow. Within an hour, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning silence. The cavalry had arrived, wildlife veterinarians, rescue teams, and fellow officers all responding to the call. As Michael watched them efficiently take over Bella's care, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Against all odds, they had made it through the night. Oliver stayed close to his mother as the veterinarians worked, but he kept looking back at Michael, as if making sure he wasn't leaving. Michael smiled reassuringly at the cub. "Don't worry, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." And he meant it. This night had forged a bond between them that he knew would last long after their wounds had healed. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the snow-covered landscape, Michael knew that this was more than just a rescue. It was a testament to the extraordinary connection that could form between humans and animals when trust overcame fear and determination, conquered impossible odds. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center buzzed with quiet activity as Michael made his way through the familiar corridors. 3 weeks had passed since that harrowing night in the storm, and he visited every day, watching the remarkable recovery of both Bella and Oliver. Today was different, though. Today was the day they'd all been waiting for. Dr. Sarah Chun, the center's lead veterinarian, met him outside the observation area, her clipboard tucked under her arm and a warm smile on her face. "They're both ready," she said, leading him toward the outdoor enclosure. "Bella's leg has healed better than we could have hoped. The muscle damage was extensive, but her will to recover, especially with Oliver by her side, has been extraordinary. Michael nodded, remembering how even in those first critical days after the rescue, Bella had shown an incredible determination to heal. Oliver had been her constant companion, his presence seeming to give her the strength she needed to fight through the pain of recovery. The outdoor enclosure was a large naturalized space designed to help wildlife prepare for their return to freedom. As they approached, Michael could see Bella moving with only a slight limp, her powerful form looking healthy and strong once again. Oliver, who had grown noticeably in the past weeks, bounded around her playfully, his own injured paw fully healed. "The poachers?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. The investigation sparked by Bella's rescue had led to the arrest of 3 men, who had been setting illegal traps throughout the national forest. The evidence found in the old mine, combined with surveillance footage and anonymous tips, had built an airtight case against them. They're facing federal charges, Sarah confirmed. And thanks to this case, the department has increased patrols and monitoring in the area. "You've made a real difference, Michael, not just for Bella and Oliver, but for all the wildlife in these mountains." As they watched, Oliver noticed their presence and trotted over to the fence. The change in him was remarkable. Gone was the desperate, injured cub from that stormy night. In his place was a confident young bear, though he still showed an unusual comfort around humans, particularly Michael. "Hey, buddy," Michael said softly, crouching down as Oliver approached. The cub made a soft huffing sound, pressing his nose against the fence. Behind him, Bella watched with what seemed like approval, her dark eyes holding the same intelligence that had first convinced Michael to follow her cub into the storm. "We've selected a release site," Sarah explained, pulling up a map on her tablet. "It's deep in the protected area, far from any hiking trails or camping spots. There's plenty of natural food sources, and our tracking data shows no other bears have claimed that territory. They'll have everything they need to thrive." Michael studied the map, noting the remote location. It was perfect, far from human interference but still within the range of the Wildlife Service's monitoring systems. They would be able to keep an eye on Bella and Oliver from a distance, ensuring their continued safety without disrupting their return to true wildlife. The release was scheduled for sunrise the next day. As Michael helped the team prepare the transport cages, he felt a mix of emotions he hadn't expected: joy at seeing Bella and Oliver return to their natural habitat, pride in their remarkable recovery, but also a touch of sadness at the thought of saying goodbye. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Michael spent one last quiet moment with them. Oliver had grown too big for the playful interactions of his early recovery days, which was exactly as it should be. He needed to maintain his natural wariness of humans if he was to survive in the wild. Still, as Michael stood by the enclosure, the young bear approached one last time, touching his nose to the fence in what felt like a farewell. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sky painted in brilliant shades of pink and gold. The transport team worked efficiently, loading the cages into their specially equipped vehicles. Bella and Oliver remained calm throughout the process, as if understanding that this journey was taking them home. The release site was everything Sarah had promised: a pristine valley surrounded by dense forest with a clear stream running through it and plenty of natural cover. As they prepared to open the transport cages, Michael stood back, giving the bears plenty of space for their return to freedom. Oliver was released first, bounding out of his cage with youthful energy. He stopped a short distance away, waiting for his mother. When Bella emerged moments later, she moved with purpose, her healed leg supporting her weight confidently. She paused briefly, turning to look back at the humans who had helped her, and in that moment, Michael felt the full weight of what they had accomplished. "Go on, girl," he whispered. "It's your world now." As if hearing him, Bella turned and moved into the forest, Oliver trotting happily by her side. They disappeared into the undergrowth, leaving nothing but paw prints in the morning dew as evidence of their presence. The team packed up their equipment in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the remarkable journey they had witnessed. As they prepared to leave, Sarah handed Michael something, a small tracking device displaying 2 blinking dots moving steadily through the wilderness. "I thought you might want to keep an eye on them," she said with a knowing smile. "They're part of your family now, in a way." Michael accepted the device gratefully, watching the dots that represented Bella and Oliver making their way into their new territory. They would face challenges, as all wild creatures did, but they would face them together, their bond strengthened by everything they had overcome. As he drove back to the station that afternoon, Michael reflected on how a single moment of trust, a desperate bear cub seeking help on a stormy night, had led to such an extraordinary chain of events. The mountains rose around him, their peaks touching the clouds, and somewhere in those vast wild spaces, 2 bears were beginning their new life, carrying with them a story of courage, trust, and the remarkable connection that can form between humans and wildlife when compassion overcomes fear. The radio crackled with a new call, another animal in need of help. Michael smiled as he responded, ready for whatever challenge awaited. After all, every rescue was a chance to make a difference, to bridge the gap between the wild and human worlds, if only for a moment. And sometimes, those moments could change everything.